Hello, and welcome to today's roundtable session with Rich Karlgaard. I'm Thea Noble, the Vice President of Platform at GSV Ventures. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Rich to the roundtable. Rich is an award-winning entrepreneur turned publisher, columnist, author, television commentator, private investor, and board director. He is the publisher of Forbes magazine and writes a bi-weekly column, Innovation Rules. Additionally, he serves as a regular panelist on cable news' most popular business show, Forbes on Fox. Throughout this roundtable, please add any questions you have for Rich in the chat, or if you're feeling brave, raise your hand and we can bring you on video. We want this to be as conversational as possible, so we're really excited to chat with you. And thanks so much for joining us, Rich.
Well, thank you, Thea. There is no more Forbes on Fox. That ended about 2 years ago, but thank you for that warm introduction. And it was fun to race here from my previous session where the wonderful and accomplished Carol Fishman Cohen, who founded a company called iRelaunch, helping people get back to work in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. And I talked about late bloomers and the workforce. So I would be happy to talk about the workforce and how people are blooming as individuals today, new styles of leadership I'm seeing, and however you want to take the conversation or people who are attending this session want to take it.
Great. I'll ask the first question. I definitely want to start off with your book, and then hopefully we get some from the people in the panel, and we will love to bring up what they have. So you recently wrote your book about late bloomers in a society where people are obsessed with SAT scores and early success. You've obviously had an envious career. What were you like as a child, and would you consider yourself a late bloomer?
Oh, I was very much a late bloomer. I was one of those people that at age 25, despite having gone to a good college, which I got into on kind of a fluke, I was unable to get any kind of connection or traction in my adult life. I mean, at age 25, I was a security guard and a dishwasher and things like that. And in fact, one night when I was a security guard at a trucking firm in North San Jose, I was walking the perimeter of the trucking yard and I heard a dog barking, and across the chain link fence was a Rottweiler. And I was glad there's a chain link fence to keep me from this snarling dog, but the chain link fence is unable to keep intruding in my mind this thought that at age 25, my professional colleague was a dog. So it wasn't until a year or two after that that things began to click for me. And then my career moved rather fast, and it had, I had to be more creative at that point because I didn't have a standard career. So a friend of mine and I started a magazine called Upside. It was Silicon Valley's first business magazine. And that got the attention of Steve Forbes, who came out to visit us, and Steve ended up hiring me to start a similar magazine. And so I've been at Forbes for 28 years. So it was the fact that an entrepreneurial effort of starting a magazine, but I don't think I would have started it had I got off to more of a conventional start in a career. I was forced to sort of find a rung on the ladder a little bit higher than I would have been if I had just crawled up one rung at a time.
Yeah. In an era of, Forbes 30 under 30 lists, why do you think society is so obsessed with success at a young age?
Well, I think Americans have always fancied themselves as a youthful country. Demographically, it's no longer true. We're sort of at the midpoint among affluent nations. The median age is 35. That's younger than the EU, where it's 42. It's younger than Japan, where it's 47. But we're not the young, youthful nation that we used to be.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the day, the great novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald said there were no second acts in American lives. And that was just kind of accepted. It turned out to be true in his life. I mean, he wrote The Great Gatsby at age 28, and he'd written 2 novels before that, but his masterwork, the work that would come to define his life, he wrote at 28, and he never got better. And in fact, he got worse. and he eventually died kind of an embittered man at age 44. But I think that especially today, if you look at the two most lucrative parts of the American economy over the last 25 years, without a doubt, it's been sophisticated high finance, that is to say Wall Street hedge funds and Silicon Valley style venture capital, and sophisticated Silicon Valley style web-based software, whether enterprise or B2C. And particularly in B2C, it's dominated by young people. Enterprise, not so much, but a lot of the trends in B2C have been fashioned by young people. Getting a job in Wall Street, if you didn't go to the right school, it's going to be hard to get that kind of a first job. If you didn't go to the right school, which means if you didn't get great SATs, you didn't get great grades, it sort of backs up earlier and earlier. And we put tremendous pressure on kids to be these super achievers. And I think some kids are young super achievers. Mark Zuckerberg is a legitimate young super achiever. Sergey Brin and Larry Page, legitimate young super achievers. But a lot of people find their stride later and really come into their own in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and even beyond. I mean, Tom Siebel, artificial intelligence company, C3.ai. I mean, Tom started Siebel Systems in his 40s. He started C3.ai in his late 50s, and now he's in his late 60s. And, you know, I predict it'll be one of the big enterprise software IPOs probably in 2021, and he's 68. Or Dave Duffield at Workday. On and on you go. So it's pretty easy to debunk the idea that if you don't achieve early, you won't achieve. Diane Green started VMware, co-founded it in her 40s. Until age 64, she was the CEO of Google Cloud. But I don't think they don't make for kind of the glamorous stories that the media likes.
Yep, exactly. It's interesting that you talk about, you know, what school you go into at such an early age. We had Scott Galloway in our pre-show of the ASU GSB Summit, and he talked about how a lot of people who go to these elite schools, it's just a factor of privilege. You know, there are some of those overachievers and some people get in on accident. Like I've heard you say yourself with getting into Stanford from being from North Dakota. So that's an interesting point.
I'm so glad you had Scott Galloway is just a national treasure. In fact, I read a piece of his today where he does the absolute best takedown of Palantir. I mean, it is shrewd, it is analytical, and it will leave you in stitches. And that's kind of nasty of me to say, but Palantir, I think, is the company that needed to be taken down, and Scott Galloway did it brilliantly. Yeah.
Love how truthful he was. And we've been having a lot of people at the summit who are telling it like it is, and we love to see that. We have a question from Pamela. So would love to bring that up. Pamela asks, how do I start this conversation about late blooming with my freshman gerontology students? They're learning about aging and pursuing traditional careers and direct trajectories.
Well, I started to research late bloomers in 2015. The book came out in 2019. So it was a 4-year quest, about 3 years of research and a year of writing it to get it right. And I felt really obligated to do some bona fide research along with a professional researcher who helped me, because I'm an amateur in this field. I knew that writing credibly about the human brain and psychology meant that I would have to dive into neuroscience and dive into psychology and behavioral psychology and all of that. And so as an outsider to these fields, I had to approach that with great humility, knowing that it would take time. But I read some fascinating stuff along the way. For example, right about the time I started the research, there was a study out of a woman named Laura Germain of Harvard and a man named Joshua Hartshorn of MIT. Were both postdocs working together at Massachusetts General Hospital, decided to launch a study and ask when do we cognitively peak? Mm-hmm. And the answer is really sophisticated and ultimately encouraging, because the answer is, what cognitive ability are we talking about? If we're talking about rapid synaptic firing, the kind of thing that makes you a great, software programmer under time pressure, or a great high frequency trader on Wall Street. That kind of cognitive ability tends to peak pretty early. As early as our teens, for most people in their 20s through our early 30s. But a whole range of cognitive abilities, including our communication skills, including our ability to stay calm under pressure, including our ability to sort of emote authority and lead and inspire. Those are abilities that we come into, most of us, later on. I mean, I think you can see it there's hardly anyone more brilliant than Mark Zuckerberg.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, Mark Zuckerberg once said that, people basically stop doing great work once they reach the age of 30. Well, Mark's now in his mid-30s and he's happily no longer saying that. But think about Mark Zuckerberg, as brilliant as he is and as accomplished as he is, has that much helped him when he's appearing before Congress? He almost looks like the least prepared. Tim Cook, who's older, Jeff Bezos, who's older, Sundar Pichai, who's older, they look a little more together than Mark does. Well, this really fits sort of the arc of our cognitive abilities. Mark will get better at that, and it won't just be because of his practice, and he'll certainly get a lot of practice no matter who wins the presidency. I think big tech is going to be under the scope, but his brain development is going to lead him to a place where he's got greater equanimity, greater communication skills, and so on and so forth. The same thing that happened with Bill Gates, absolutely rapid fire, brilliant, and a man who absolutely then fell apart in and around the year 1999 and 2000. And today, Bill Gates comes off as this very mature senior statesman. And that just sort of those are illustrations of how kind of our brains and emotions move throughout our lives. So as we think about careers that we should be pursuing, or we think about mapping out our career, generally we move from the hyper gifted specialist toward the team leader, toward the group leader, toward the executive with communication skills, then finally toward the end, toward the teacher and mentor.
Yeah, great. We have another question. This one's from Daniel. Daniel says, Rich, seems like your approach and your story could apply to many aspects of life. What's one thing to focus on and a thing to avoid as you launch out on your next thing?
Part of a thing in the book that really came from a deep personal place was I wanted to tackle the subject of self-doubt, because a lot of people who feel like they're late bloomers in the context of wherever they are, they're a student in high school or college and they're watching people get perfect test grades and perfect scores on their standardized tests. They're getting job offers from leading companies, or wherever you are, you're looking, your friend in their 40s is now in the C-suite at their organization, and you're not yet. And so people who are late bloomers, who feel like they haven't quite put it together, they haven't arrived at that perfect intersection of their deepest native gifts and their deepest sense of mission. Because that's what I think we aspire to be. And that's where we have the greatest prospect of blooming. And if you're not there, there's a chance you probably have not a small amount of self-doubt and some amount, let's face it, of shame.
Mm-hmm.
And so what does that mean? When we really look at the neuroscience, we look at the psychology of that, it means that the first thing we have to do is really separate our sense of self-worth from our self-doubt. Self-worth is inherent. We're here. If we come from a religious tradition, we know that we're here for a purpose, perhaps created in the image of our Creator. And even if you're more agnostically inclined to really accept the fact that you have inherent self-worth just by the fact that you're here. Therefore, self-doubt, once you separate it from your self-worth, wall it off, then you can kind of clinically look at the self-doubt and say, what the heck is it telling me? You know, I don't like hearing this.
Mhm.
I don't like right before I'm about to give a speech, or right before I'm about to do a sales presentation, or right about before I'm having my annual conference with my boss is going to determine my, how much I'm paid for the next year. Self-doubt's creeping in now. Why? It's natural. It happens to everybody. It happens to the greatest performers. But the greatest performers and the ones who've learned to deal with it look at it as it's information. The information
Yeah.
could be maybe you need to prepare better next time. It could be maybe you need a partner in this project. It could be maybe you need, maybe you need to get a better night's sleep. Maybe you need a lot of different things. But as annoying as that sounds to you right now, it could be pretty helpful. Carol Dweck, who teaches psychology at Stanford and wrote a best-selling book called Mindset, says about this nagging self-doubt. She said, think of it as an annoying person with a dorky name who always shows up he shows up right when you're about to sit down for dinner, as it were, always at the wrong time, always annoying, sort of like Newman in Seinfeld, somebody like that. And you learn to look at them. And she said, the dialogue you have with your self-doubt is, oh, you again, tell me what you have to tell me, then go sit down. You don't try to pretend it's not there. You just say, oh, you again, what do you have to tell me? Thank you very much. Go sit down. I'll deal with it. And so I think and then that involves how you learn to talk to yourself. Studies will show, this sounds rather trivial, like how could it possibly make a difference? It turns out it makes a big difference. When you coach yourself, your own self voice should be in the third person. So, you say to yourself, I'm a little nervous about this presentation I'm about to give. You say, Thea is looking a little nervous today about this presentation to give, and then the real Thea can go, I wonder why there is that perception. It's a way of walling off self-doubt. So the shame is simply when self-doubt undermines your self-worth.
Yeah.
And it's a horrible thing. We all suffer from it, but there are sort of in the research of this book, people who do bloom have learned to deal with it, and they learn to deal with it by walling off self-doubt from their self-worth and looking at it as information.
I think those are great practical tips. And obviously everyone deals with self-doubt or, on the flip side, imposter syndrome. So those are definitely important. And I've also read research too that self-awareness is super important for entrepreneurs as well. Successful entrepreneurs and founders have a lot of self-awareness. So I'm sure that all lines up really well. In your book,
this imposter syndrome. Last week I interviewed, it's for a Forbes series, a woman named Shelley Archambault, and I think Shelley might have been participating elsewhere in the summit. But she was the former CEO of MetricStream. She's on the board of Verizon, Nordstrom, Okta, and one other Silicon Valley startup. She's female and she's Black. And she just about the most dynamic person you could meet. And next week, she's got this wonderful book coming out that I recommend called Unapologetically Ambitious. And when you talk to Shelley and you read a book titled Unapologetically Ambitious, you kind of get a picture of what she's like, and that picture would be true. And so for Shelley to say, that as we did in the conversation, that the imposter syndrome is something that she deals with every single day of her life.
Yep.
And that she thought for all that she'd done and has done and will do, that it would eventually recede and go away. And it doesn't. And so, that's why it's important to acknowledge, oh, you again. And it was refreshing, her honesty to say that, to put a name to it. CEO self-awareness. I don't know. Are you sure about that, Thea? I think there are a lot of.
Yeah.
I think there are a fair number of deluded ones. The ones who think they're, to be the next Steve Jobs, they have to act like Steve Jobs.
Yeah. Well, I used to work at an accelerator, and something we did was working with the founders on their self-awareness. So, when they're giving out a pitch, what are the adjectives that they want people to describe back about the business and about themselves. And then we actually had the people do that, and we saw if they aligned, and kind of worked on the self-awareness part, because it's something that we can all work on as founders specifically.
I do think that one of the silver linings of COVID is that a new style of leadership is emerging and becoming dominant. That it wasn't that long ago where the model of effective entrepreneurship leadership style was a Steve Jobs or a Travis Kalanick, or even for a while before her company was exposed as a fraud, Elizabeth Holmes. I mean, these people came off as hyper confident, and if they broke eggs to make an omelet, that was okay. And that seemed to be quite acceptable in the Valley. And I think that's not working so well anymore. I think Glassdoor is kind of destroying that, the transparency that Glassdoor brings. But I also think that in the age of COVID, that it's so important for leaders today to be able to emote to their customers and their employees that they deeply care about their customers and their employees. They deeply care about outcomes, and they deeply care about doing it in the right ethical and moral way. Because, holding a culture together today, I think it's a huge challenge. We know that 25 to 50% of adult Americans right now are suffering from some kind of a low-grade depression. That means you're 25 to 50% of your employees, Mr. or Ms. CEO, are down in the dumps. They're not performing at their best. They need motivation. They need to know from you that what they're doing matters, and what the company is doing matters, and how it's improving people's lives. And I think that I'm kind of glad. Well, I think we're all glad if that does in fact turn out to be the case, that the new leadership style will be that of Satya Nadella, or Eric Yuan of Zoom, whom I interviewed a couple of weeks ago, or Lisa Su of AMD. I mean, these are a different breed of leaders, and I think it's about time. I hate that it took COVID to maybe accelerate that style of leadership to the forefront, but I think we should be glad that it's happened. And these are people of great emotional IQ, and I think this great emotional IQ, I think it takes a while to develop. Going back to the late bloomer thing, if you look at a photo of Eric Yuan, you don't realize he's 50 years old. You don't realize that the trench warfare he went through, at his years. First of all, trying to get in the United States took him 9 tries to get from Beijing to Silicon Valley. And then it took him the years and years of toiling to make WebEx successful and work. And then the years and years of trying to convince Cisco that they had more than Cisco realized, and so Zoom looks like an overnight success, but it's not. And I think Eric's got the right combination of leadership and equanimity and emotional IQ, because he's not 25, he's 50.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we actually were able to have Eric during our pre-show.
I saw that
as well, which we were very excited about. And we have a question from an audience member about Eric as well. So I think this is a perfect transition. Michelle asks, in your recent Forbes article, you discussed Zoom's happiness strategy. What would you advise other companies to perform the same strategy?
Well, the context of how his happiness answer came up was that I asked Eric, I said, look, you weren't the first video conferencing company, but Facebook wasn't the first social media company either, and Google wasn't the first search company. What is it about, what was it about Google and Facebook and now about Zoom that allowed you a later start, and to zoom past, if you will, all the incumbents? And he talked about that he uses WebEx experience. He worked at the startup called WebEx. Cisco bought it. Cisco made the mistake of thinking it was kind of a down market version of their upmarket technology called telepresence. You might remember that, 15 years ago, telepresence, big a big custom built operation costing hundreds of thousands of dollars that only, Wall Street firms and big firms could really afford to have. And somebody you could only teleconference with people on the other end of the telepresence system. So they too had to be telepresence customers. And it was sort of Cisco thought of WebEx in the same way Digital Equipment Corporation thought of PCs. They finally get into the PC business, and lo and behold, if you can find a DEC PC today, hold on to it because it's probably has museum value. And what he discovered, what he liked least about the direction of WebEx under Cisco, and by the way, he's very complimentary toward John Chambers and the other people reported to. He just thought that Cisco had done too many acquisitions, that they were paralyzed. They had to slot things into formulas. And so it didn't, nobody could really think creatively about it. But what he noticed is that nobody seemed to be really happy about being a WebEx user. He didn't find people weren't lit up in the way that people were lit up by being an Apple Macintosh user or later, an iPhone user. Apple's great core competency is to bring that sense of delight to its customers. And so he wanted to be that kind of a video conferencing company. And so he said, the strategy is happiness. If we create happy customers and we're relentless about it and we work harder to create happy customers and happy employees, we will succeed. And so that has been part of their land and expand strategy. If the individual using Zoom is happy in doing Zoom calls with their friends, and there are enough of those people who then go to their employer, and where there might be some existing video conferencing system that is harder to use, clumsier, and doesn't bring that sense of joy, then eventually those employees will convince the IT people to make Zoom the product of choice. And then Zoom, and they will become a paying customer. And so that's how Zoom has been able to penetrate corporations, and today it has a market value of, $140 billion. It's just this incredible story.
Yeah, that is incredible, and so amazing that you're able to talk with him and hear his story as a late bloomer. So speaking about Zoom, obviously now a lot of us are working remotely and work from home. How do you go, so we have a question from Simon. He asks, how do you go about maintaining culture in a remote environment?
I think it's hard. And I think it's really separating the kind of inherently good corporate cultures and good leaders from the ones who aren't. Being a transactional culture alone doesn't work. That was a trend already in the making. I know Tom Siebel quite well, and I interviewed Tom on stage at a live event pre-COVID, but not too many months before. And I said, you were at Oracle very early. I think he was on the first 20 people at Oracle, and he rose rapidly there. Then he started Siebel Systems, and now C3.ai. And he said, I asked him, is the way you motivate people different today? And he said, oh, very much so. That in the Oracle days and in the Siebel days, you motivated with the comp plan. Whether that was because baby boomers and Gen Xers were people who were inherently motivated by the comp plan, as opposed to millennials and Gen Zs, I don't know. But the fact is that there has been a change, and this is pre-COVID.
Yeah.
So millennials and Gen Zs are seeking meaning. They're seeking some sense that they're on the right side of the social justice wars, particularly after George Floyd's death and the elevation of diversity and inclusion to the highest level and discussion across companies. And so you put all of that together, and you add it in the COVID environment where you don't get to do retreats and things like that. And I think that there's no question that companies have to motivate differently. They have to lead differently. They have to lead authentically. If they don't, Glassdoor will out them.
Yep.
If you don't walk the walk. There's a CEO that I like and admire, and probably you do too, who was caught out not walking the walk. And he's a good guy, and I know he'll recover, and that's Mark Benioff of Salesforce, who was sort of months and months ago came out with a book and then a series of articles about how capitalism has to be reborn from a shareholder model to a stakeholder model, encompassing sort of not just the people who own your company, but the people who own your company, work for your company, your customers, and the larger community. And that's stakeholder capitalism. You have to realize the footprint that you're leaving. So leave a good footprint that doesn't hurt society. And on August 25th, their stock surged after they set a record quarter number. And he was on Jim Cramer's CNBC show touting that stakeholder capitalism is not only the right thing, but it produces results. Well, good for him. Then the next day, Salesforce announced it was laying off 1,000 people from August 25th to August 26th. Oops. That hurts. Mark is big enough, accomplished enough, a great enough guy that he's got enough momentum that's not going to undermine him. But he's certainly not going to do that again. Yep. And that's because we have much greater transparency. And I think he's actually a great CEO built for the COVID era because he leads from his heart. But just saying that, you really got to walk the walk today in a way, for a variety of reasons, from a glass door to what you have to do in a world where diversity inclusion is sort of a higher urgency and in COVID.
Yep, totally. It's very, very important. It's funny because I was actually previously talking to one of my coworkers, Sophie, that one of the main reasons that we joined GSV was the focus on EdTech and how, we're an early stage venture capital firm, but we're really focused on expanding and increasing access to education for all. And for us, we're like, we'll have any role, we'll be in any environment, but we really care about the mission. And so I think we definitely identify with what you were talking about for sure.
Yeah, well, Michael Moe is a prince of a guy, and you can tell him that. And my wife thinks that, and that's the reputation he has outside of the education and venture capital community. So that's the kind of sort of integrity that really pays dividends today.
Yep, he definitely is. He actually recently launched a boot camp for free for around 5,000 people around the globe, where he was just providing them with startup experience, and just because he wanted to help people specifically who perhaps maybe, are having a second career, maybe they're late bloomers in all different stages with pandemic, to equip them. And so that was something great that he spearheaded. And speaking of Michael Moe, I actually see he's one of our questions, so I'll ask his next. So thanks for joining, Michael. Michael asks, can you talk about the role of being humble? The question of a fellow former North Dakotan where being humble was part of the culture, at least when I was growing up there. Oh, might be another Michael M.
Okay. In late June, I interviewed, I've done 2 interviews with ServiceNow people. ServiceNow is just on a tear, great enterprise software company. And I interviewed Bill McDermott, the CEO, in June. And then a couple of weeks after that, a friend of mine and I, whom Michael Moe knows, Jamie Montgomery of March Capital down in Santa Monica, interviewed Fred Luddy, the founder of ServiceNow. So I'll talk about the Luddy interview first. Luddy was one of those sort of, naturally humble people, grew up in small town in Indiana, and his humility was a real virtue in a couple senses. He co-founded a company that had brief success, and then turned out the CEO and CFO were not ethical people, and they drove the company into the ground. Fred was the CTO, and none of it tainted him, and it shouldn't have tainted him. So he had to start all over at age 49 with this idea of ServiceNow. And the two things where his humility really helped him. Number one is, as brilliant as Fred Luddy is, he knows that the customer is even more brilliant when it comes to what the customer really wants. And he talked about a thing that he'd done earlier in his career where he helped an overworked typist simply, you know, on a PC, simply avoid repetitive typing by creating a little, you know, a little workaround where she could cut and paste. This is sort of when it was hard to do cut and paste kinds of things. And she cried, she was so happy because it meant that her, you know, her neck wasn't as stiff and her elbows weren't as stiff. She wasn't in physical pain from hunched over typing repetitively. And that always stuck with him. The other thing was that after he started ServiceNow, he realized that he was humble enough to see that he was not the CEO who could take this company where it needed to go. And so this first outside CEO was a guy named Frank Slootman. Frank Slootman just took Snowflake public.
Wow.
Just you know, a few days ago. And then they had John Donahoe, who's now the CEO at Nike. And then he was able to persuade Bill McDermott to leave SAP to join the smaller company ServiceNow. So it was that humility that he knew that his best job was solving customer problems and then having really good executives run the company. And that was the kind of humility that I think has created this juggernaut. Bill McDermott, you know, the watchwords at ServiceNow are stay humble and stay hungry. You know, I mean, they've had tremendous success at ServiceNow. Stay humble, stay hungry. He must say that phrase, you know, dozens of times a day. That's how important he regards sort of humility, because humility is really a generosity of spirit. It's being able to see the world through the customer's eyes, the employee's eyes. It's not self-abasement. You know, I think sometimes our culture does a really poor job of saying what true leadership humility is all about. And you see it in Fred Luddy, and you see it in Bill McDermott, you see it in Eric Yuan, you see it in Satya Nadella and many others.
Great. Yeah, we were also able to get John Donahoe to the boot camp as well, which was pretty fun to hear Michael interview him as well. So thanks for sharing that. I have another question here. So this is from Michelle, and she's asking, how transparent should leaders or managers be about their own self-doubt to their employees?
That's a great question. I think the answer is not too much. I think you need to be empathetic, and I think you need to show that you care. But I think confessing your deepest worries that's for your mentor. And I'm also struck by if this observation that I think is true, that we're a new style of leader, that the old jerk king, you know, the Travis Kalanick, Elizabeth Holmes, even to an extent, you know, the late great Steve Jobs. These were know-it-all leaders, and Jobs is the exception because he had the great mentor Bill Campbell there, and I don't know what kind of conversations Steve had with Bill Campbell. Bill Campbell was famously very protective of Steve Jobs, and that's why he was such a famous coach and mentor, is that he didn't, you know, he never whispered to the press, you know, what our conversations were about. That said, I don't know if the inner Steve Jobs, you know, had those moments where he confessed what he was worried about to Bill Campbell or not. It was an effective relationship. The larger point here is that I think employees today, with the rate of change in business, with the concerns about the COVID economy, with everybody being tighter than a rubber band because of the divisive politics that are loose in the country, I don't think you want a CEO who shares too much. You want one who cares a lot and is empathetic, but you don't want one who, just like you don't want, you know, the greatest style of parenthood is not to become emotional peers with your kids. It's still to be the parent. And I think people want that kind of leader, but that means that leader has to have great mentors. Jamie Montgomery and I were were recently interviewed for one of my Forbes shows, Renee Lacerte of Bill.com, a really good company in its field, cloud-based, growing fast. And Renee has used a lot of mentors over the years. He's used Scott Cook. Scott Cook, the founder of Intuit, is kind of everybody's favorite mentor today. And Renee has used him. And so I think that's a role for the mentor. So it's really good to know who your mentors are and find the mentors that are really valuable, can help you in that way, and to whom you can confess that you're having self-doubts, or that something is not working in your life that is not directly related to your business, but it's beginning to tow you down, or that you're suffering maybe some kind of low-grade depression or whatever it is. That's the thing you don't share with the employees.
Yep. Let's flip from, the side of self-doubt. You talk about 6 strengths in your Late Bloomers book. Can you dive in a little bit deeper to that on the strength side?
Sure. The 6 strengths that are available to late bloomers and early bloomers are like, I'm glad you asked, and I actually wrote it down. Since this is my second interview of the day with these wonderful people, I thought that I might be my memory would not be quite as sharp toward the end of the second interview. Curiosity, compassion, resilience, equanimity, insight, and wisdom are traits and attributes that, whether you were an early bloomer or a late bloomer, you can cultivate, and they will, all 6 of them will put you in a position to bloom and to keep re-blooming. For all this focus on, in places like Silicon Valley and Seattle and Boston, New York, and where you have high performance cultures, and you have educated upper middle class and wealthy people trying to provide the best opportunities for their children, it's sort of gone too far where kids are valuing their worth and parents are valuing their worth as parents, depending on, did the kid get into the right school? Well, that depended on what their grades were and their SAT scores and so on and so forth, putting a lot of pressure on kids. And frankly, a lot of companies sort of, particularly in Silicon Valley, screen, they like people who went to hard to get into schools and who did get good test scores. It's sort of a validation if they have the right stuff to succeed at Google or Facebook or Intel or Apple, whatever it is. And yet, Fortune magazine in the year 2017, not my magazine, Forbes, but Fortune, in its annual Best Places to Work, asked some high-performance CEOs, the CEO of Intuit, the CEO of Genentech, and others, what's attribute do they most value in their employees? And the word that came up was curiosity. And that's because curiosity is sort of the foundation, the lodestone of a person's ability to grow and to continue to be innovative throughout their lives. And unfortunately, I think with this focus on getting good grades and getting good test scores, we've taught kids that the way to success is to master the test rather than to open up the aperture of your vision to see wider and to be curious about what the world is like out there. So curiosity is really valuable, and it needs to be cultivated, and good CEOs cultivate it. Compassion, Jeff Weiner of LinkedIn said, empathy is not enough. Empathy is a feeling, compassion is action. Compassion, really good salespeople feel compassion for their customers. In this age of heightened diversity and inclusion, feeling compassion, not just empathy, but what are you going to do? Resilience is simply endurance. It's the ability to overcome hardship. I think that's a perennial. But a lot of people today, I think Carol Dweck at Stanford said her incoming freshmen at Stanford are brittle. They're not resilient. They don't want to mar their perfect records, as she said. So she tries to teach them resilience. Equanimity is one of my favorite words that I fell in love with that word while doing this book. And that's the ability to stay calm under pressure. That's Captain Sullenberger landing the jet on the Hudson River and getting everybody out. It's Tammy Jo Schultz landing the Southwest Airlines in Philadelphia after an engine blew up in mid-flight and the engine went through the window and destroyed the pressurization and killed a woman, and she landed and everybody was safe. It's the ability to stay calm under pressure. And that's a great thing to be able to develop. And there are a lot of ways you can develop that. Insight is the ability to take, it's sort of like your mental cookbook. Can you take ideas, an idea from over here and meld it with an idea from over there to come up with a unique idea? Insight is what Steve Jobs had when he took the world of popular culture and the world of Silicon Valley geekdom, you know, in the personhood of Steve Wozniak, and combined it to make great personal computers and late after that, great phones that still had that panache and social cool. Insight is when Bill Walsh, the great football coach of the 49ers back in the day, saw from fast break high school basketball that he could develop an offensive system in football based around a lot of short passes. And when he drafted Joe Montana, what he saw in Joe Montana was a basketball point guard. And indeed, Montana had been an all-state basketball player in high school in Pennsylvania. And then wisdom. Wisdom is the ability to see the big picture. All of these things, curiosity, compassion, resilience, equanimity, insight, and wisdom, are things that will sustain you well throughout your entire life. There are neurological and psychological reasons for that. And I give the reasons in my book, Late Bloomers.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We have to wrap up, but everyone go out there, get Late Bloomers. And I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us today. And thank you for joining the summit.
Thank you so much, Thea. It was a great joy. My session with Carol Fishman-Cohen before and now with you. And I just love what GSV is doing, and in particular this conference. You become big and mighty, and you become like the Davos of education.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, you can also, everyone can watch both of those recordings on demand. And so thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.